Let's start. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining tonight's event, The Road Ahead, Working Towards Racial Justice and Equality. My name is Christiane Pyka. I'm the director of the German American Center, or BAZ, DAZ in Stuttgart. This event is a cooperation among the US Embassy in Berlin, as well as the consulates general throughout Germany and the DAZ in Stuttgart. It takes place on occasion of Black History Month, which is celebrated in February. However, all of us know Black history is American history, and as it shouldn't be reduced to just a single month. Therefore, we include Black voices and issues that Black people in America are facing today in our programs throughout the year, not just in February. But to come back to today's talk, earlier this year, Kamala Harris made history by taking office. Even through the first Black woman is now vice president, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US are still disadvantaged in many areas of daily life. They are confronted with discrimination and racism on a regular basis. But this is supposed to change now. On his first day in office, President Biden signed several executive orders that aim at advancing equality and reduce discrimination on a federal level. Our panel will take a look at these first steps towards racial equality and justice and discuss how we as societies can contribute to more just communities in the US, but also in Germany. Please let me add that already during the talk, you can use the Q&A or F&A button to type in questions, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible after the talk. This button you can see on your screen at the bottom edge. If you feel more comfortable asking the question in German, you can do so and we will translate them. Please note that the chat function will be disabled throughout this event, and you will not be able to turn on your microphone or your camera. In this regard, we are a little bit like Fort Knox. Now, from my side, a very big thank you to the moderator of tonight's event, Professor Waldschmidt-Nelson, and our panelists, Professor Price and Professor Banita. I would also like to thank Dr. Martina Cole from the US Embassy for the organization, and my colleagues Katrin Büttner and Max Heinemann for the technical support. Finally, I have the pleasure to announce US Consul General Darion Akins from the US Consulate General in Hamburg. Consul General, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Frau Pyka, for your kind introduction. Herzlich willkommen zu heutigen Black History Month Veranstaltung. Welcome to all of you to today's Black History Month event. My colleagues at the embassy and at the consulates and I are grateful for the partnership with the German American Center Stuttgart, our host today. Thank you, Frau Pyka, and your team for making this event possible. And thank you to our colleague from the embassy's cultural section, Dr. Martina Cole, for putting together yet another outstanding program that facilitates the transatlantic exchange of thoughts and ideas on shared issues. A special welcome to our panelists, who are distinguished scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. Professor Price and Dr. Banita, we thank you for taking the time from your busy teaching, research, and writing schedules to join today's transatlantic conversation. And a quick shout out to my fellow Texan, Professor Price, hello. Our moderator this evening is Professor Waldschmidt-Nelson, who will introduce both panelists in a moment. African Americans have played a central role in American history and in our country's efforts to strive for a more perfect union, for equality, justice, and freedom. Their courage and determination to fulfill the promise of America have not carried one group forward, they've carried the entire nation forward. Black History Month honors these contributions, the lives, achievements, struggles, sacrifices, and experiences, both past and present. This year's Black History Month theme in the US is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. Using the family as a lens through which we explore Black American life and history as part of the larger American family has inspired institutions in the US to create related programs during this month. Today's discussion will go beyond this theme. President Biden, on his first day in office, signed the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. He's sending a clear signal to the American people and to the world that his administration is committed to working towards a more just society. The document outlines the administration's policy for advancing equity, civil rights, racial justice, and equal opportunity. Our nation's diverse heritage and history make us who we are as Americans. It makes up the American story. This story depends not on any one of us, not on some of us, but on all of us. I'm heartened to see that Black History Month has received much more attention in Germany as well. Both our societies can learn from each other and our joint efforts to overcome systemic racism and provide equal opportunity to all individuals and communities. Both our societies can embark together on the road ahead. We're doing so with today's discussion. It is my honor to introduce Professor Waldschmidt-Nelson, our moderator and a most prolific scholar. It is a daunting task for a diplomat to compress an academic CV as rich and long as Professor Waldschmidt-Nelson's into a few sentences. Nevertheless, allow me to try. Professor Waldschmidt-Nelson is a professor of transatlantic history and culture at the University of Augsburg. Previously, she served for 5 years as deputy director of the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. Professor Waldschmidt-Nelson also taught American history and culture at the University of Munich, where she earned her PhD summa cum laude, of course. She has been a visiting scholar and guest lecturer at numerous universities in Europe and the United States. Her research interests include African American studies, transatlantic relations, and gender and American religious history. Much of her work is transnational in scope, comparing 20th century US and European history and weaving together our intertwined past into transatlantic narratives. The long and impressive list of her publications includes monographs, as well as the edited volumes and articles, I would like to mention 2 of her most recent books: Inventing the Silent Majority in Western Europe and the United States, Conservatism in the 1960s and 1970s, published in 2017, and a biography of Malcolm X in German, published in 2015, the first German language biography of Malcolm X. Professor Waldschmidt-Nelson is also a frequent commentator on American history and transatlantic relations for German television, radio, and print media. Thank you, Professor Waldschmidt-Nelson, for sharing your expertise and guiding us through today's discussion. And thank you to our audience for joining us this evening.
Okay, I guess then I take over now. And first of all, thank you so very much, Consul General Akins, for this very gracious and generous introduction. I also would like to use this opportunity to thank the American Embassy very much, and of course the German American Center in Stuttgart for organizing this wonderful event. And of course, I want to thank the 2 panelists, Melanye and Georgiana Banita, for joining us here tonight. And it's my great pleasure to introduce both of them to you now, because they are incredibly accomplished scholars. And I'm especially both honored and delighted to introduce Professor Melanye to you. She is endowed professor of political science at Prairie View A&M University in Texas. And she also serves as the university's principal investigator for the African American Studies Initiative. Professor Price's academic career actually began at Prairie View, where she completed her BA magna cum laude in geography before moving on to obtain her master's and PhD in political science at the Ohio State University. So quite a switch from geography moving to politics. Before coming back to Texas, Melanie Price was an associate professor of Africana Studies and Political Science at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, and she taught at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And here she did something that I find very remarkable. She served as the inaugural professor for Wesleyan's College in Prison program at the maximum security men's correctional facility. So I'd love to hear more about that experience at some point in time. Professor Price's research and teaching interests include Black politics, public opinion, political rhetoric, and social movements. It would take far too long to tell you about all of her publications now, but let me just mention that her first book, Dreaming Blackness, Black Nationalism and African American Public Opinion, published in 2009, examined contemporary support for Black nationalism. And her most recent book, The Race Whisperer, Barack Obama and the Political Uses of Race, published in 2016, examines the various ways in which President Obama strategically used race to deflect negative racial attitudes and to engage with a larger cross-section of voters. Professor Price's current research project is called Mountaintop Removal, Martin Luther King, Trump, and the Racial Mountain. And it utilizes King's famous mountaintop speech as a lens for understanding the rise of Donald Trump and the 2016 election. Besides her great accomplishments as an author and professor in the United States, Melanie Price has also been the 2017 Black History Month lecturer for the US Embassy in Germany. So that's when you were here before. And moreover, she has served as a popular commentator on questions of race and politics on American and German TV as well as radio stations. And last but not least, she was a contributor to Stanley Nelson's excellent 2017 documentary movie, Through the Fire, The Legacy of Barack Obama. So needless to say, we are very excited to have such an accomplished colleague here at our panel. Thank you so much for joining us from Texas, Melanie.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, yeah. And I'm also very happy to introduce another highly esteemed colleague to you now, Professor Georgiana Banita, who comes to us from the University of Bamberg, where she serves as Professor of North American Literature and Culture. Professor Banita's academic career began in Romania, where she did her undergraduate studies in English and German literature at the Alexandru Ioan Cruța University in Iași. And I apologize for probably not pronouncing that name correctly, but I don't know Romanian. But she finished her undergraduate studies there and then moved to Germany and completed a master's degree in English, American, and German studies at the University of Constance, with distinction, I may add. And after a year of studying at Yale University, she then came back to Constance and completed her PhD there in American Studies with an outstanding dissertation entitled Plotting Justice, Narrative Ethics and Literary Culture After 9/11, which was published as a book in 2012. Professor Banita finished her second book, the so-called Habilitationsschrift in Germany, at the University of Bamberg in 2020, with the fascinating title, Writing Oil, North American Literature in the Petroleum Age. Besides North American literature, Georgiana Banita's research interests include migration and political culture, the history and politics of fossil and renewable energies, the war against terror, photography, and post-colonial studies. So it's a very broad range of interests. Most recently, she has been involved in a research project on policing in the United States and in Europe, dealing with the ethics of policing, as well as the significance of race and big data in this context. Earlier this year, her first findings on this topic were published in Germany in the short book Phantombilder, Die Polizei und der verdächtige Fremde. In English, I think it's approximately Phantom Images, the Police and the Suspicious Stranger, but I think it has not been translated yet, hopefully soon.
No, I'm still thinking about the title. It's pretty tough, actually.
Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, it sounds
I like
really
Phantom
exciting.
Images. I'm gonna put my vote in for that.
Sounds very
Thank you.
exciting. And I want to also thank you very much for being here, Banita. I think it's great that we have two outstanding scholars here who come from such different academic fields. One from the area of political science and African American studies, and the other from the field of literature and cultural studies, and both with a strong focus on race and on social justice issues. So I think this will make for a very broad and exciting discussion. And I'm really glad that you both are here with us tonight. So, but now enough about all this introductory talk. Let's get started with the discussion. And as Christiane Pyka already said in the beginning, our topic today is the road ahead, working toward racial justice and equality. So what we mainly want to do tonight is to look forward, and we will discuss what might be needed to move more to a more effective way to overcome racism and social injustice on both sides of the Atlantic. However, I'm not so sure how much knowledge of African and Afro-German history is there among our audience. And so I want to make sure that the members of our audience are somewhat on the same page regarding the status of people of African descent in the US and in Germany. And therefore, I thought it might be helpful to start off with a question regarding the historic background of the situation that we see unfolding today in both countries. So let's start with the United States, where, as we all know, it took the federal government a whole century since the end of the Civil War to finally pass legislation prohibiting the legal discrimination and the political disenfranchisement of African Americans. So my first question goes to Melanie, and I would like to ask you, in view of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, what would you say have been the most important improvements regarding the situation of African Americans since the 1960s, and what are the most urgent problems that still remain? Go ahead, please.
Sure. Let me just say that there's probably no piece of legislation, probably the two most important, I think, political acts for African Americans in terms of political visibility might be the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees people who are enslaved in the occupied territories during the Civil War, which leads eventually to the emancipation of all African Americans from slavery, and then the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which ensures that they actually have access to political participation. One establishes their citizenship essentially, and the other one enforces their ability to be participating citizens. And so I think those things are particularly important. Now, one of the things that I will say is that since then, the thing that has been most powerful is the ability to see the wide-ranging effect of African Americans being able to vote. That is, we see in places like Mississippi, where African Americans were not just barred from voting, but lived under conditions of racial terror for centuries. Now you see the largest number of Black elected officials in that state. And part of that is because it's also a place where lots of African Americans live. And so we have started to see the election of African Americans, their influence in the political process, and the candidates understanding that they have to respond to the needs of African Americans. And probably the culmination of that was the election of Barack Obama, right? Which sort of is the moment where people are like, this is the thing that African Americans have been working for, to rise to all levels of power. Now, in response to the election of Barack Obama, there were lots of efforts to ensure that there will be no more Barack Obamas after him. And in 2013, there is a famous Supreme Court case called Shelby v. Holder, which essentially kills the Voting Rights Act. It takes away the ability of the Department of Justice to oversee the election process in states that are covered, and they're covered because they are states that have been proven to engage in discriminatory practices. And so since 2013, many of the protections that were established in the 1960s have been undone because the Supreme Court said it could be. And so we actually are sort of moving into a moment that looks a lot like the 1960s, where we are trying to get Congress to pass legislation. We're trying to get states to not engage in voter discrimination. And so in many ways, I tell people our times are not the same, but they look a lot like emancipation and a lot like the 1960s, where we are again having to reaffirm things that we thought were settled rights, things that we thought, battles probably our foreparents thought were settled facts, right? We didn't believe that we were going to have to relitigate the need for African-American voter participation. We didn't feel that we were going to have to relitigate the fact that African-Americans are citizens who shouldn't be killed on the streets. Like, these are the kinds of things that our grandparents would have thought, had been settled. And now we find ourselves in a place, again, where we're having to renegotiate those things.
Okay, thank you very much, Melanie. I completely agree. Now, from the United States to Germany and Europe, of course, the situation of Afro-Germans and other people of color living in Germany has been very different from African Americans in the United States. One difference is the size of the community. In the United States, African Americans make up about 13% of the population, which is a very sizable part, whereas in Germany, even though the numbers have increased a lot since the 1960s, it's still less than about 1% of the population. And so that is one difference. Another major difference is, of course, that there was no legal segregation or no real legal government-sanctioned political disenfranchisement of Afro-Germans in the Federal Republic of Germany. But nevertheless, of course, there have been other forms of discrimination that apply to Afro-Germans, as well as other people of color and other immigrants in Germany. So my question to Georgiana would be, what have been, in your view, the most important improvements regarding the situation of Black people in Germany since the 1960s? And again, what are the most urgent problems that still remain today in your view?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for having me again and for asking me this challenging question. I'm sure that we will have an opportunity to engage with this in more detail in the course of the discussion, but I would like to just preface what will follow by taking seriously the occasion of this meeting, namely Black History Month. So I would like to take this opportunity to honor a portion of this history, a particular biography that has been largely forgotten. I would like to honor the life of Fazia Jansen, a Black German peace activist, an artist and a singer, a performer of protest songs, and a supporter of the labor movement. Black German artists have recently found in her an important source of inspiration and courage. Jansen was born at the dawn of National Socialism, and she suffered persecution for being non-Aryan. Specifically, she was forced to cook in a concentration camp. She wrote powerfully about what she witnessed there, about the violent beatings of prisoners as they gathered to receive their food. And she talked about the violence that she herself had to endure. Above all, the fact that she was forced to work in a concentration camp interfered with her artistic education and her aspirations to become a dancer. After the war, she sought compensation from the German state for the discrimination and abuse that she endured, but she was refused. As a Black German, she was allegedly not among the groups persecuted under National Socialism. This is, of course, not true. And something that I think we should bear in mind when we think about Black history is the way Black history has been left out of very important historical narratives, such as that of the Holocaust. Another question that has gained in urgency is that of how to address histories of racial injustice. What can be done in terms of compensation or reparations? Specifically, what can be done to support Black communities, both in the United States and Europe, in overcoming the material inequities and the psychological damage inflicted by slavery, fascism, and colonialism? And in particular, I think it's important to think beyond the obvious progress that has been made in respecting the integrity of Black lives and increasing representation of Black communities in the public sphere. In Germany, for instance, Black writers such as Rachel Dodua-Otoo have been awarded very important literary prizes and are published by prominent presses. But it still seems that this is a kind of symbolic politics that focuses on the visibility of the community, but not so much on the hardships of those members who are most at risk. So the final point I want to make is that Black history challenges us to find new alliances that cross not only the boundaries of race, but also those of class. And in mentioning Fazia Jansen, I want to draw attention to a history of Blackness that is also a history of the poor and of those who didn't so much struggle to find and to express an identity, but to simply survive. And we can see how battles for survival can be very similar, like the battles of Black and Jewish Germans in the Third Reich. Rachel Doduo, too, recently gave a powerful address where she insisted that such histories be placed in the same context, that they should be taken together. And I just want to echo that thought in agreement. Thank you. Just to open up and provide some historical background. I know there is much more to say, and we'll have an opportunity to
and we'll get back to
get into some depth.
Political representation and other things later, but
yeah.
I'm very glad also that you brought up the issue of history being forgotten, because I think one thing that is where Germany is way behind the United States in terms of talking about its racialized history is that the history of colonialism, at least when I went to school, was absolutely not spoken of. It just didn't exist. You know, the fact that the German Reich had colonies and all that was going on in Western German, so-called Southwestern German Africa and other things, that was completely wiped from the curriculums. And I think it's one of the things that needs to change, is to make people more aware of our history in that regard. But we can get back to that later, okay? Yeah, well, let's move forward a little bit now, because I think one of the issues that has been on everybody's mind, especially, of course, since the terrible death of George Floyd last May, was the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And not only in the United States, but also here in Germany and in other European countries. I remember I participated, this is during the Corona lockdown situation, I participated in a Black Lives Matter solidarity demonstration on the Odeonsplatz in Munich. And they had expected 500 people, about 500 people to come, and we ended up being 20,000 people, which was absolutely amazing. And so my question to both of you would be, how would you describe the significance of the Black Lives Matter movement in recent years, not just last year, in the United States and Germany, especially also regarding the role of Black women in that movement, the non-centralized structure of it, and also the question in what way the movement has affected Black and white relationships in different ways? And maybe perhaps Melanie can start with that, and then we'll move to Banita, or we can just throw in whatever anybody wants to say.
One of the things that's always so interesting about racial politics is because we don't spend enough time, I think, in sort of bigger outlets paying attention to what people of color are doing generally, we often seem shocked when major things happen, like how could this happen, as if it just started. So when people are in the streets this summer, all of a sudden people start to take note, as if this isn't a thing that has been going on for almost, I mean, we're almost a decade into this, right? I think 7-8 years or something like that, that Black Lives Matter has been sort of a hashtag, but also a movement. And so as we think about this, one of the things that we know is that African Americans have been protesting, have been working to figure out how to stop not just violence from law enforcement, but also vigilante violence. So we have to talk about both of those things. It's both the police and also private citizens who feel free to police Black bodies, to try to control the spaces that Black bodies inhabit. So think about the fact that Black Lives Matter as a hashtag is first started when Trayvon Martin dies. Trayvon Martin is not killed by the police.
No.
He's killed by a citizen who believes it is his right to police where Trayvon Martin gets to walk. And then it really starts to take hold as a sort of more of an organized movement process at the death of Michael Brown, who is killed, in fact, by a police officer. And so what Black Lives Matter really is trying to say is that for some reason in this country, white people still continue to believe that they actually have the power to control all of the spaces that Black bodies inhabit, whether they're in their own communities, whether they're walking in a neighborhood or jogging in a neighborhood like Ahmaud Arbery, where people believe they shouldn't be, whether they're in their own home sleeping in the middle of the night like Breonna Taylor. There is no place where African Americans can be that white law enforcement and private citizens don't believe that they have the option of entering and controlling how that space is used. And so one of the sort of most hopeful things about that, I think, the thing that makes last summer different is because you start to see Black Lives Matter protests in places where there are very small Black populations. And that means when you see Black Lives Matter movement events in Salt Lake City, Utah, or in Portland, Oregon, then the vast majority of the people participating are non-Black. And I think that is sort of the maturation of a movement that has been working to bring voice to this issue for years now. And so that's the thing I think that is interesting to think about. I think it shows a new level of progress. But let me also say something else that's been important about Black Lives Matter, because we focus a lot on what's happening in the streets, but I think they probably have also made one of the most important electoral interventions, that is in terms of voting here in this country. And that is one of the things they started doing pretty early on was when they saw, so I don't know if you in the American legal process, most of you have probably watched, I don't know, Law and Order. I'm sure that seems like something that exists, across the globe. But there's some American procedural show where when someone is killed, it is the district attorney, it is the city attorney, the prosecutor, it is their job to bring that case before a jury to decide whether or not the person who committed or is alleged to have committed this crime should be indicted, that is, should be brought up on charges. And what was happening in a lot of these cases is that the district attorney, these lawyers, refused to do so, even though they were elected officials. They were elected by the people to bring forth cases and charges against people who had committed crimes. And we know they do it often for African Americans, but they were not willing to do it in terms, especially of police officers. And so what Black Lives Matter started doing was saying, oh, you're an elected official, so what we're going to do is get you out of office. And one of the things they have done is that we've seen much more progressive district attorneys, much more progressive prosecutors being elected across the country who have made commitments to not just bringing police officers involved in shootings up on charges, but who also who have also agreed to stop doing things like prosecuting people on small marijuana charges, who have stopped the process of requiring people to find bail or to sit out their process or no bail, who have taken away the ability of individuals to bail themselves out of jail, that is to pay a fine so that while their case is pending, they can still live their lives. They have taken away lots of things that were actually making it harder for African Americans to extricate themselves from the legal process. And so that's another thing that has been really powerful. So it's what they're doing in the streets, but it's also the strategies they're taking to mitigate some of the problems within the American legal system as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Melanie, for also pointing a light at that issue that you're totally right, often gets neglected on the way. Yes. And it's hugely important. Georgiana, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I think it's also important to bear in mind that the killing of George Floyd was a very powerful media phenomenon, and it spread very quickly also because it's in international language, really, this language of violence and the language of silence and not being allowed to breathe, literally, resonated with a lot of people. And it also, I think, expressed on a more metaphorical level, this idea of living under the oppression of racism, this idea that you cannot breathe, that you cannot express yourself, that you cannot live in full, that again, married people could identify with, even though they themselves were not at risk of being a victim of police violence. And that's also how I explain the popularity of the movement in Germany. Partly this has to do with, some political reasons, some emotional reasons, and also just the mechanics of living in a pandemic, I think. Because there's a level of identification with George Floyd that goes beyond Blackness, that just speaks to otherness and to this idea of fear of authority, of fear in walking down the street, of being observed, of being an object of suspicion by everyone, not just the police, but also by other citizens. That's something that a lot of immigrants also can identify with. People that have been marginalized by society, or that are, sometimes fearing, maybe not for their lives, but certainly for their well-being to some level, on some level, if maybe not physical, but certainly psychological. Another reason I think has to do with the fact that Germany has been shaken by a series of right-wing extremist attacks that have created a new sensibility for the subject. And in addition to that, there has been increasing evidence that right-wing extremism has also infiltrated the police forces, that there are a lot of very racist, really, ideologies that have spread and have found supporters among the police. And what makes this even more problematic is the fact that the German government is refusing to investigate these accusations. So there is a complete blockage of all attempts by researchers to study whether or not and to what extent racism exists in the German police forces. So that there was certainly some common ground. And the other thing that I find interesting is Black Lives Matter is a kind of so-called neo-community. A lot of sociologists in Germany have spoken about these Neo-Gesellschaften, these new ways of coming together, usually through social media, by finding common voices across borders and across boundaries of all kinds. Some of these movements of these communities can be quite dangerous. I mean, the incel community can also be seen as a neo-community, and that can be quite sexist and racist. But Black Lives Matter also spoke to people very directly through social media and allowed them to find an identity and a voice at a time when they felt quite uncomfortable with what was going on around them, because many minorities saw their problems exacerbated by the pandemic. You know, they had to deal with unemployment all of a sudden. They had to be isolated from society more than they usually are. And it was a great way to vent certain frustrations that they attached to the idea of Black lives as lives that are vulnerable and lives that are fragile and that need special protection. And the results have been, I think, in the US clearer than in Germany, and very specific, that in the sense that many companies have now introduced minority hiring quotas, and many institutions, especially federal institutions, have cut off ties with police departments. Partly it's a symbolic gesture, but it also carries a lot of weight. And I haven't seen that much in Germany. There has been I remember in the first days of the uproar, there was a scramble in the German media to find Black people to interview, you know, just to ask them, so what is it like to live in Germany as a Black German? And there are all these sports personalities and celebrities speaking about their experience, and then it kind of just disappeared. It didn't. I don't have the sense that it's as sustained and as far-reaching as it has been in the US. So we'll just see whether it's just one of those things that comes and goes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jana.
Can I add something to that? One of the things that I think that is true sort of globally is that sustained discussions of race. So people of color and other marginalized people often think about race and difference all the time. It's a constant thought. It's something they consider when they go to dinner. Is this a place that might be unfriendly to me? It's something they think about when they buy a home. Is this a community where my children would feel safe playing in the streets? It's something they think about when they go to the store and look for certain kinds of products that are meant for the hair types of people of color. So they think about it all the time. But part of white privilege is the ability to not have to think about race. And so it is uncomfortable because they don't do it a lot. And so the goal is to talk about it, to get through the discussion as fast as you can, and then move on to something else. And what that often means is you never actually diagnose sort of the problem and get to the root of the problem. So for instance, I'm sure most of the people who are watching this know what happened. They are aware of what happened in the American Capitol on January 6th. And by January 7th, people were like, let's just get to the healing. What we need to do is we need to heal. We need to think about what's going to happen in the future because it's too uncomfortable to spend time actually talking about the reasons, the ideas that underlie how we got there. And that's a global problem that has to be addressed, right? If you're going to actually fix these problems, it has to be a sustained discussion, because part of what you're going to have to do is undo lots of the incomplete history you have been taught before, right? So in America, we start as little kids saying, I pledge allegiance, to the United States flag, and about how it's all about liberty and we are all equal and we are all these things. Well, Black children know that that's not the case. I mean, they say it every day, but they know that there are these inequities, right? But white children are in fact never taught that these things are not exactly true. And so as adults, you're having to fight against that thing that has been sort of instilled in them from childhood to build a new thing. And that's why in Germany and in the United States, the goal is let's hear what you have to say. Now that we have heard you, we can go back to our normal lives, to our normal programming, to the way we were before.
Yeah. And I thank you very much for adding that. And I agree, of course, with both of you. However, maybe regarding the situation in Germany, I do believe that while you're right, the public discourse has sort of decreased a lot. But in the government discourse, for example, with the way the Hanau incident has now been commemorated, in Hanau a year ago, a racist shot several people, or also the fact that there is now, because of the pressure created by Black Lives Matter and its supporters in Germany, our Secretary of the Interior, Seehofer, again, after a long time of refusing to, has now actually committed his department, to do an investigation of racism within the police force. And just this morning, I listened to the report of our Wehrbeauftragte, who says that one of the major problems she's dealing with is really trying to go through with an entire investigation of investigating all cases of right-wing extremism within the military forces. And I think that these investigations are going on is at least in part a result of the pressure that was created. So I think that's actually one of the things that makes me very hopeful. What made me also very hopeful is, as you said before, Melanie, that these demonstrations of Black Lives Matters are carried now in many places and have gotten also organizational support by a lot of non-Black people, because people are starting to see. But at the same time, and that would be my next question to you guys, there is of course a problem that in a way, every progress made because of that growing awareness pushed for by Black Lives Matter has also, in my view, increased the fire of white backlash with some people who are really sort of upset and say, this is getting too far, this is too radical, and they're criticizing whatever, that there's too much condemnation of whiteness and heteronormativity and all these things. And I think one of the places where it really materialized is the monument debate in both the United States and in Germany. It's more streets than monuments. But in both places we have, in the United States, it's all these monuments of people like General Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and other heroes of the so-called Confederacy who are being honored for standing, for waging a rebellion against the United States government and trying to maintain a system in place that maintains slavery and glorified the supposed superiority of the white race. And in Germany, we have a lot of streets, not so much monuments, but a lot of streets have been named for officers of the colonial troops in Africa. And there has been a lot of debate going on when these streets are being renamed now. And there have been a lot renamed, especially in Hamburg and in Berlin, for example. So how do you guys view that situation? How can one move forward without at the same time giving putting more oil into the fire of the white backlash? Or is that just totally unavoidable? I don't know who wants to start.
I'll let you start, Georgiana.
Yeah, Georgiana, maybe.
I'm always like, I have a lot of time to think about what I'm going to say because Melanie's going first anyway.
Well, if you think about the Berlin debates about the streets, there's been a lot.
I can go first. Yeah. I can go first if you want.
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay, good.
No, I mean, I haven't really encounter these debates at all when I was studying, for example. When I was a student at the university, there wasn't any discussion of, can we take this author seriously, or was he a racist, and is it something that we must bear in mind? And it was quite shocking to me to read a book recently where it was pointed out, and something that I saw for the first time, some of the most rabidly, brutally anti-Semitic statements ever made by luminaries of German literature and philosophy, such as Fontane or Hegel. And it's not something that was ever a subject of discussion during my studies or even later on. And I think in America that has changed a lot. There's I know of this particular campaign in San Francisco that has led to a lot of schools being renamed, and the personalities that were targeted, whose names were essentially kind of deplatformed in this context, included George Washington and Jefferson, and I think this personally, I think that it is an effort that sometimes can go too far, or reach a point where it's not so much about the cause, but maybe about, some individual people's pet peeves or something that they always wanted to say or they always wanted to do. And I remember in that discussion that there was a school that was named after Malcolm X, and someone suggested that, Malcolm X was a pimp. So he subjected women. Shouldn't the school be renamed? And it was decided against it because this one particular flaw wasn't sufficient to overwrite his life's achievements. But that isn't something that was permitted for some of the other figures, such as Jefferson or Washington. And I think it is a very important debate, but also one that, because it's so sensitive and because it's so personal, can lead to a lot of backlash.
When I think about this, I have several thoughts about this. As the Consul General mentioned, I am in Texas. So I live in the South. I mean, some people call it the Southwest, but in some ways we are very much linked to the Confederacy and that history. So, I mean, I have a general working belief that if you were a member of an organization or some kind of organization that sought to undermine the nation, that we should not, in fact, have statues to honor you. So the Confederacy was essentially a domestic terrorist organization, and so we should not have statues to domestic terrorists. But I was also born in a hospital called Jefferson Davis Hospital. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. He was the head domestic terrorist. And so but by the time I was born there, it was really a hospital that was for indigent people or for poor people, and mostly children of color were being born there. And it just seems to me that a place that is meant to cater to a particular group should not be named after a person who sought to enslave them. And if he got his way, if he had actually been successful, then it would be his goal that my people and people who look like me would still be enslaved.
Yeah.
And so therefore, I don't think there should be monuments to them. I don't think you should just, I don't know, take baseball bats to those monuments and sledgehammers. I think you should put them in museums, right? I think there are lots of Confederate graveyards. Put them over there with the rest of them. You know, there are places where we can have discussions about the fact that these people existed, about what they meant, without celebrating them, without naming military bases after them. So they fought against the American military, and now there are military bases named after them, right? Without naming schools after them. Like, there are ways to talk about and think about this history without actually celebrating them as heroes. And I'm sorry if, you know, you live in the state of Texas and your family, you know, were part of the Confederacy and you love your grandfather. This is not about sort of personal affection for individuals. It really is about what it says to the people who those Confederate soldiers sought to harm, who they sought to oppress. Do I have to then live in the situation, attend a school that seeks to honor them? Because those are honorifics.
Yeah,
right?
that is a very important point. And actually, what both of you made, I think, I personally totally share both of you, and especially Melanie's view with regard to that as a nation, we, or in this case, the United States, should really think about what does it mean to have somebody on a pedestal. It means you honor them. And you're absolutely right, in my view, and this is a view I think one can make explainable also to whites who, for example, come from the area of the Confederacy. You say, well, this was a rebellion against the United States government, and so we cannot honor these people. But at the same time, I think, and there Georgiana is totally right, I think, for example, now trying to throw off George Washington and Thomas Jefferson from the pedestal or blowing up their memorials in DC, that goes too far for a lot of people, because and again, I would make it the question, why do we honor people? And Thomas Jefferson is not honored for the fact that he was a slave owner and fathered children with Sally Hemings, but he's honored for the fact that he wrote the Declaration of Independence, that he was a major founding father. He founded the University of Virginia. He was the one, together with Madison, instituting the Religious Freedom Statute and the separation of church and state, and a lot of good things. So the question is, what do we honor people for? And if you have that approach, I think that would maybe be a way of making this whole policy of changing, memorializing and changing street names more acceptable to a lot of white majority people who think, oh my God, this is going too far. But unfortunately, some people are going too far, and that breeds more conflict.
Because people are opposed to this, are often opposed to it because they don't have a sense of why you're taking down the statues. These are statues, by the way, that people have walked by for generations and never read them, right? It's the kind of thing that exists in society. You name things after parks, and after generations, you name a park after someone, and generations later, people don't know who these people are.
Yeah.
And so there are buildings on college campuses that are named after Confederate soldiers. There are all kinds of things that exist that we don't know until someone tells us about it.
Exactly.
But it's also important to know that the vast majority of these Confederate statues that people are trying to protect were not erected in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Yeah.
They were erected mostly in the 1950s and 60s as a way of shoring up a history that the people putting it up knew was a lie, as a way of trying to intimidate African Americans in places where they were trying to resist. So at the height of the civil rights movement, lots of these statues go up. The cities are saying, you may be fighting for your rights, but we are going to ensure that you continue to talk about the people who were opposed to your rights. And so it's not like they were saying, oh, my daddy died in 1865, and then in 1867, let's put a statue up. It was 1967 that these statues go up, in 1965 that these statues go up. 100 years later, where they're merely put up as a symbolic way to intimidate psychologically the people who live in their midst.
Absolutely, and that's a whole different story. It's a whole how the lost cause mythology was built up.
Right, which was all crafted at Southern universities by historians, exactly, where they sought to figure this thing out. Like, this is not about people who have been celebrating from the very beginning their Confederate heritage.
Right.
This is about people who have come together to figure out how they can keep a piece of their own racist history alive using tax dollars that African Americans pay to actually do it, because we pay for those schools as well. We pay for those parks as well. And I just don't feel like my money should be used to pay for Jefferson Davis Park.
Absolutely. And I have a feeling we could talk a long time just about this one issue, but I'm looking at the clock and time is racing.
I know.
So let's move forward a little bit in time now. And what I'm very interested in, and I know our audience is interested in, to hear you talk about how you view the Biden administration's new approach. At the beginning, Consul General already mentioned that Biden, on his first day in office, signed this remarkable declaration, or executive order rather, on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And also, we all know that his cabinet is, in terms of racial, gender, and ethnic diversity, the most diverse ever so far in United States history. So how do you both view this approach of the Biden administration? Do you think a lot of that is just sort of more symbolic value and trying to pacify people who elected them, the Black community, the left wing of the Democratic Party? Or do you think this is a chance to really get a new start on racial issues and to change something that is sustainable? I don't know, maybe Banita, Georgiana wants to go first this time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, I have some very positive feelings personally about the new administration, and some concerns that there can be too much of a good thing. Sometimes, historically at least, because anything that goes too far in one direction triggers backlash in the other one. So it is symbolic. I think it's also very powerful and symbolic to have such a diverse cabinet. And I still remember the day of the inauguration and the tremendous performance by Amanda Gorman and this Black poet who just appeared like, you know, phoenix out of the ashes of the past 4 years, you know, pointing the way to the future. Very symbolic, very superficial. I mean, I was shocked a little bit after that to hear that she now has a modeling contract with a major modeling agency. I was thinking, oh, you know, you're just asking people to market, you know, you're just making it too easy for them. Yeah, so I think it is very powerful. I also thought it was powerful immediately after the inauguration that Biden decided he wants to get rid of the concept, the phrase illegal alien at the federal level. So not just in the states where it's already not used anymore, but just in all immigration laws, you don't use that term anymore because it is so loaded and so stigmatizing. Again, it's a symbolic kind of politics, but on the other hand, what the country probably needs is a period of tranquility, a period of maybe positive thinking, of trying to overcome the moment with something like symbolic politics, with something like surface decorative politics. There's nothing in itself that is damaging about that. My fear is that at the moment there's very little concern for bipartisan collaboration on many levels. So there's of course on the one hand this urge to satisfy the people who voted for the Biden administration, and for someone like Kamala Harris, you know, just also partly a very historically powerful achievement. On the other hand, I think Kamala Harris would be a great candidate in the next election, and she has tremendous chances. And one has to be very careful not to ruin those chances by doing too much too quickly, because there's only a couple of years, and then practically the next campaigning will begin. And I hope that this reform is going to be successful. I am particularly interested in what's happening at the level of immigration law, the introduction of the path to citizenship for undocumented migrants in America. I think this is very important, goes further than what the Obama administration did, and that is quite remarkable. I'm just a little bit uncertain because it's all too much too soon. Like it's almost too good to be true. And I'm sort of waiting. I wonder a lot, what do those 70 million, 72, 74 million voters who voted for Donald Trump think? Like I wish I could be a fly in their brains to have a sense of what is going on, and whatever is going on, how that's going to find explosive expression at some point.
Mhm.
Yeah. So much for me on that.
I
Melanie.
think symbols matter a lot. I think sometimes we often are so angry at symbols because there's no substance behind them. But I think we need both, right? And so representation matters. It's important. You know, I have a nephew who's 11 years old, and the first, years of his life, he only had a Black president. And so he is a Black kid who believes that Black people can be president, which is not the thing that I thought, right up until the day Barack Obama was elected. I was like, I don't know if this is going to happen. I don't think this is not a thing that's going to happen. But for him, he's like, I had 8 years of a Black president. Like, what? Obviously, this is a thing that happens. And that is a symbolic change, but also really important. So I think that's important to say. And I think Joe Biden, in many ways, has sort of the lowest and highest hurdle of any president ever. That is, if he looks sort of organized and coherent, he has done so much more than people believe about the previous president. But also, he doesn't just have to figure out how to look competent. He has to figure out how to really address really serious, substantive issues that are creating serious problems in this country, and that if they are not addressed, they will only fester. And so it's a very hard position to be the cleanup guy, right? To be the person who has to fix, who has to fix these problems. Here's the thing that I think that makes me happy about this. If he tries to rely too heavily on symbolic things, all of these groups, Joe Biden was very lucky in that lots of grassroots organizations around the country chose to work for him in order for him to get elected. That is, they used their own networks to encourage and mobilize people to vote for Joe Biden. That's how he won in Georgia. That's how he won in Arizona, in Nevada, in these key states that sort of put him over the top. It wasn't his party organization that got those people out to vote. It wasn't the Democratic Party organization that organized those people. It was grassroots activists who said, we really want to get rid of the guy who was there before. We think Joe Biden is the choice that we have, and we're going to put our word and our name behind him. If he does not engage in some of the substantive things that they want him to do, those are independent networks. They can use those same networks to say, hey, people we mobilized, he's not doing the thing we want him to do. Let's figure out how we can protest him. Let's figure out how we can come to bear. And the threat of that is the thing that I think will make it be more than just symbols. It will be the thing that will force him to engage in sort of substantive changes that are important to the people who voted for him.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Melanie. And I totally agree with you on the importance in shaping, especially young people's self-confidence with regard to who is leading a country. Like, I have 3 daughters who all grew up now with 12 years of having a female chancellor, the first female chancellor ever. And so for them, it's like, sure, a woman can be chancellor. Same with having a Black president. So that's hugely important. And I think one of the most heartening choices that he made, in my view, is the fact that with their parliament, he put, for the first time, not only for the first time ever, a Native American woman into the cabinet, but also as the head of the Department of Interior, who is in charge of Native American affairs. And I think that matters a lot. However, at the same time, the difficulty will be, and there I'm coming back to what Georgiana said on, we have seen that when Barack Obama was president, that he was only able to do very little, for example, to really improve the economic situation of the most disadvantaged communities, and especially the African-American community, because of the total obstruction of the Republican opposition in Congress. And the climate has been one, very much contrary to decades ago, that there is very little bipartisan willingness for bipartisan support of legislation. And as we all know, everybody was so focused on this election on the fact that Donald Trump was defeated, which was, of course, a very noticeable fact. However, when you think about the other outcomes of the election, on the state level as well as the federal level, the Republicans really won. They gained 17 seats in the House of Representatives. They didn't really lose in the Senate, with the exception of Georgia, and I'll come back to Georgia in a second. And in terms of state legislatures, they won 3 new ones. There is a 2/3 majority now for Republican-governed state legislatures, and that in a time when now, because of the census, the redistricting starts. And unfortunately, this is always very amazing to Germans because we're used to proportional representation and not majority rule. With districting, you can really hugely gerrymander outcomes of elections in the United States. So I find that outlook a bit scary. And so my question again to both of you is, looking at the incredible success of Stacey Abrams in Georgia, of being able to flip those 2 Senate seats, somebody that nobody had really, including myself, dared to hope it would happen. Do you think that power of organizing and an amazing Black voter turnout is possible to turn things around and make sure that the very fragile majorities in Congress at the next elections are not lost? What do you think? Or what would one need to have? What could one do?
I think it's possible, but I think also every state legislature run by Republicans is trying to ensure that that doesn't happen. And the way that they're doing that is they're going to redraw the lines in way the I don't know what you would call them in German, but the districts where people get elected from, they're going to redraw them to make sure that Republicans win every single district they possibly can. And that means that oftentimes the state leadership is not really reflective of the politics of the state, but reflective of way you have sort of rigged the map so that your people can win. And this happens every 10 years. Every time there's a census, the line gets redrawn, often because there's a limited number of seats in the House of Representatives. And so if you lose population in your state, then they take away seats from your state and give those seats to states that have increased population. So what that generally means is Florida, New York, California, and Texas gets more and more seats every time because it's states where the population is growing. This is the thing that I tell people all the time. The most important and most impactful progress that African Americans have made it has almost always come from the central government. That is, if you think about Emancipation Proclamation, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of those things have forced states to live up to the general agreement of the Constitution that all people are created equal. It is never the states that volunteer to be more equal. And so I think that the only answer to sort of fixing the voter suppression issues, to fixing the ways in which legislatures are now going to create obstacles to vote. So for instance, in the state in Texas, you used to be able to just vote for whatever party you were voting for, and you click that button and then it would fill in all your party's people. What they decided in 2018 is that they didn't want that to happen anymore because they wanted to figure out how to stop people from being able to choose that. And so now you have to choose one by one, every party. That's fine if you're in if you're in a small place, you might have 5 pages of ballots. Where I live in the city of Houston has 4 million people, you have 26 pages of ballots. And so you have to go through 26 pages clicking on the Democrat or clicking on the Republican if that's who you're going to vote for. It's just a way of sort of discounting people's votes. All of those kinds of things happening at the state level have to be cured at the federal level because the federal level thinks about all people, not just the state. And so we are counting right now on the fact that under a Biden administration, we will get a new Voting Rights Act that sort of reinstates some of the things that were lost in Shelby v. Holder in 2013, but also addresses some of the new ways that states are attempting to limit the ways that people can vote.
Right. Thank you, Mel. And Georgiana, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, gerrymandering is a real danger, and there are some plans on the Democratic side to come up with different measures to increase their own electoral chances. For instance, by creating 2 new states with DC and Puerto Rico, and by stacking the Supreme Court, which is the nightmare of all Republicans. And these are some measures that that can guarantee some level of fairness in as far as voting rights are concerned. And since we're talking about Black history, you know, it's important to remember that some states still find ways to discount Black votes. Reminding us constantly that a Black vote didn't used to be a vote, that it was only a partial vote, and that Black citizens were not counted as full-fledged voters. And that is something that is still ongoing on some level, just finding new ways around that and introducing new ways of disenfranchising Black voices. Whether the solution is ground game, as in Stacey Abrams style, I mean, this is certainly something that Obama initiated very successfully. It's something that Trump actually also practiced very well. So that in itself can really support both parties. What I think is very important is to maintain a level of mobilization, not only among Black voters, because, you know, the question was, can Black voter mobilization make the difference, right? And I think that it has to be a broader coalition. I think that only bringing out the Black vote isn't necessarily going to do it, because there are many other minority groups that are growing in size much faster than the Black community is. I mean, there are some predictions that in 50 years' time, African Americans are still going to be about 12 to 13% of the population, while Latinos will be up to 25. And that just makes clear the importance of creating alliances and coalitions between different minority groups if moving forward, these basic rights are to be maintained.
Mm-hmm. This is
Can I add two things?
1 second, Melanie, because
sorry.
I'm looking at the time and
it's
time to open this up to the audience. I had one more last, well, I had lots of other questions.
Go ahead.
One question, because Georgiana's comment leads directly to that, is the question of forging alliances with other groups, cross-racial, cross-ethnic alliances. Who do you both think, and I'm not just thinking of the United States, but also in Germany, what would be the best sort of potential partners for such alliances, partners that already have served in the past, and maybe new groups that one could get to mobilize for a progressive coalition for social change? What is your opinion, both for both countries? Whom should Black people address to further their cause with them?
The good news is that's what I was getting ready to talk about, actually. You led me right into it. That's why when I was making my comment, I mentioned Georgia and Arizona. And so Georgia is an example of majority African-American political power, and Arizona is an example of Latinos who essentially did the same kind of grassroots organizing that overturned the result, that changed the results of their state through their mobilizing. But I also want to talk a little bit about what's happening in Georgia. If you look at Stacey Abrams' campaign in 2018 and what happened in 2020, one of the things that you'll see is that Georgia has a much smaller but growing Latino population and Asian American population. And so Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight, they had similar kinds of mobilization happening among, this is their coalition group, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and whites who share their sensibilities. Right. And so what they found is, rather than trying to persuade or convert people who would never sort of support them, they found white voters who were of a like mind and who were interested in the kinds of political changes they were interested in. And then they got out the vote among people of color. And if this is going to be successful, that's what is going to happen in other states. And this is the reason why that is important, is because Texas is, we keep saying this, but it's on the verge of switching over from being a Republican state to to a democratic state. And if that happens, if one more big state changes to being democratic, then the route to the presidency for Republicans is foreclosed. They will not be winning for the foreseeable future. And they understand that. And that's why voter suppression is coming on so strong, because they know that their route to the White House is being closed because the demography, the constituents that they have is not a growing population. The Democrats have a growing population voting for them, and it is going to be the reason why, if there's a fair playing field, they will continue to win more and more. And so Republicans have in some ways decided that they're not going to change their policy positions. They're just going to figure out how to sort of rig the system to make sure that they can continue to win.
And maybe one could add, and they're also trying to gain votes. I mean, Donald Trump was actually able to obtain a larger share of the African American vote than any other Republican candidate in the last few decades. Almost 20% of males voted for him, only 8% of females. And we could talk about that now, but I won't let Georgiana comment before we then open.
I have no answer, so
before we open this up to the audience. So Georgiana,
it's really the same thing. Just a multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition is the way forward in a country like Germany, which is still very monolithic, racially monolithic. It's not as diverse as the United States, obviously, is in the process of changing. In a country like Germany, it's important to find those progressive topics that are likely to resonate with the white population. And there's so many of them. I mean, I was mentioning this Black German earlier, who was an activist for peace, and she was also an activist against fascism. And these are, and she was an activist for the labor movement. These are all universal causes. So you are going to have people from all walks of life, of all races, being interested in pacifism, being interested in workers' rights, and recently and increasingly the problem of climate change. So I think there are many coalitions that can be forged along those lines, not just about racial justice, because racial justice is implicit, is contained in a lot of other problems, including that of climate change. So many communities are threatened by climate change that are mainly minority communities. And this is the case everywhere. It is the case in Germany as well. So I think moving forward, this is probably, the only solution, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Georgiana. Thank you both again. And I have a number of questions here from the audience. So let's see. The first question is, in how far should school curricula in the US be adapted in order to improve the knowledge of African American history and culture among predominantly, but not only, white Americans? What role does and should education play in combating racism?
I think, textbooks in the state of Texas, that's a tricky proposition, right? So Texas is a state that buys textbooks for the entire state. Whereas in other states, individual little school systems buy the books. And because we buy this is a capitalism problem rather than an education problem. Because we buy so many books, we get to control a lot of the content in those books, right? And so there was a big push a few years ago for to play down the issue of slavery, to play down certain kinds of issues that might make students feel uncomfortable. That's the kind of thing that foments racism, not help it. And so one of the things that we have to do is to make the story of America a more complicated story. And we often don't do that because it's prettier to be able to tell this story about how, Ben Franklin chopped down the cherry tree and discovered gravity. It's these things that rhyme. This is easier for us than to have our children have really difficult conversations about slavery and about these kinds of negative issues. But one of the things that I would offer is that whether it's in the textbook or not, undocumented children are having discussions when we talk about equality in the Constitution about the ways that they're not treated equal. African Americans, whether it's in the textbook or not, are having these conversations. And when white students are not having these conversations, then it makes it seem like undocumented children or Black children or Latinos are lying when they tell you the story, because they were like, I was never taught this. This was not in my history book. And so what we need to do is put as much information as we can in the textbooks that explain where people were. So you take an American history course and you can only pinpoint Black people at slavery, at the civil rights movement, but they existed during this whole time. And that's one of the only ways, I think, to begin to think about racism. But the problem with that, again, is asking people to be uncomfortable, right? And I think learning begins. I think Georgiana might agree with this too, that our students often learn the most at the moment where you sort of break down the things they thought they knew and introduce new things. But
yeah. Okay.
Some people in America would call that indoctrination, liberal indoctrination.
Do you want to add something, Georgiana, or shall we?
Speaking of liberal indoctrination, I don't. This is true, and trying to apply this to Germany is also kind of makes me uncomfortable, because there's still a lot to be done in terms of diversifying the curriculum in German schools and universities, and to make people more aware of history, and especially painful histories. And I remember that I showed in one of my classes this amazing Holocaust documentary, Night and Fog, by Alain René, and some of my students started to cry because they had never seen that before. And I'm not sure that I would still do it today, right? I mean, because the tendency is to become more and more protective of the other, especially in a school environment, in a university environment. You don't want to make people uncomfortable. And so I agree that that's somewhat problematic, and that students should be able to develop the kind of skills that are needed to make sense of something like this, and overcome negative feelings to reach to something that is illumination, right? And the other thing that I want to point out is that maybe education, especially about Black history or minorities, shouldn't be reduced to universities or schools, because I always had the sense when I speak to my students that they already agree with me, that they know exactly where I'm coming from, and they nod all the time. And I wish I could maybe reach some people that would not necessarily nod, that would look at me and go, what is the benefit of giving a major literary prize to an immigrant journal writer? To what is the benefit of diversifying society in this way, of welcoming these new voices? I'd love to have a conversation about it, right? So that's also education outside the walls of universities and schools that is very necessary. And in America, I keep thinking about all these prejudices that are partly true regarding Trump voters, that many of them are uneducated, that many of them don't really know the historical problems that have led to lots of inequities today. And they don't have a university degree, right? So I'm open to ideas about how to educate people on more, maybe in untraditional environments.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot ideas I could share, but I'm looking at, we still have a number of questions. So in order to be able to address hopefully all of them or most of them, can I ask you guys to keep your answers as short as possible?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So next question is, on the internet, there are sources where including African Americans, for example, Will Smith, say it is time to start being post-racial and starting to see people as individuals rather than categorizing individuals into racial skin color categories. I often think that education and wealth is what should be the focus rather than skin color. What do you think about this thought as a goal for the 21st century to overcome this categorization?
I will say that I don't believe in post-racialism. I think often post-racialism is a way of saying, let's stop talking about race, because if you see a person as an individual, one of the things you see about them is their race, right? The problem is not that we see people's race, it's all the negative stereotypes and assumptions we make about them because of race, right? It's all the ways that we use race as a heuristic, as a shortcut into diminishing their humanity. And so what is more important is that we learn to humanize people including their racial category as often and as much as we possibly can. So one of the things, a thing that's been happening a lot over the last year with all of these protests and stuff is that Black people like me who have friends who are not Black, lots of them have been asking all of these questions about what they can do and all. Anyway, it's been a lot. And so, you know, one of the things that I tell people often is if your kid, in what way does your kid interact with people of color? So if you have children and your kids interact with people of color, do they ever interact with them as co-equals? Or are they the people who serve you your food, who cut your yard, who clean your house, who do these kinds of things? Because if that's the only way they interact with people of color, then they learn that kind of thing. And so you may not be talking about race to them, but they're seeing it because they have eyes. And so I don't believe in the notion of post-racialism. I do believe we have to figure out how to not attack, how to undo all the negative stereotypes we have attached to other people. And in that way, racism will be less of a problem because I want you to know that I'm Black. It is important to me that you understand that and that I want you to think about the fact that I'm Black when you start talking so that you don't say things that might offend me as a Black American. Like, I don't want you to I don't ever want to be in a post-racial world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Melanie. Not very short, but very important.
Sorry.
No, very, very, very important what you said.
Yes.
It's really, it's so true. Thank you. Georgiana, did you want
I agree. I mean,
the next
I completely subscribe to it. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think we all do. Next question is directed to Melanie directly. Do you think the voting system is still up to date? In what ways is it still discriminating against people of color?
It's so the equipments are a whole set of problems. You could have a whole panel on the voting equipment and how it's different in every state and sometimes different across, you know, from one part of a state into another state. But the problem really is the laws that govern it, right? The things that, so for instance, here you have to pay for a state issued ID, and that can be costly. Not only that, but you have to get a state issued ID. And these centers where you go get them are very rarely in the center of the city. They're almost always in places that are difficult to get to, but you can't vote without it. And so there are ways that we can make access to the ballot simpler. This year we had drive-through voting for the first time in Houston because of COVID. Why can't you drive-through vote all the time? Why do you have to actually do it on a Tuesday during the workday where you go into a place? And so there's lots of ways that the voting procedures need to be fixed as much as the systems.
Right. Thank you, Melanie. And Georgiana, I'm just going to shoot the next question at you so we can speed it up a little bit. The question is, what do you think might be the most important legislation to pursue for the Democrats, considering them now having the Senate majority? Or one could say having the majority in both houses right now for 2 years.
The most important legislation at the moment is to deal with the COVID crisis. And to deal with it in a way that is equitable to all communities. And that means special attention to communities that have been disproportionately affected, including the Black community. Mm-hmm. I think that is the most important thing. It is historically the most important thing. He is a new FDR. This is a new New Deal. And it is the most urgent, certainly. And it includes racial policies that are of great importance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that because the COVID crisis would include universal health care, because if we had that, lots of these things.
Absolutely.
Like it includes lots of things that we don't necessarily consider part of the COVID crisis that could be solved in that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you both. Next question, last but one, I think. What part does the young generation play in transforming the political system in the United States and Germany towards racial justice and equality? Is enough done in the education system, or do you think that the young generation educate themselves successfully, ? Through social media, internet shows, for example, The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver? I don't know who wants to
John Oliver.
Yes. I think all of those things are important. I think young people are learning lots of really great things and they're learning to be organizers, but there's also a lot of, I don't know how else to say it, but trash on the internet that they're also learning too. And I don't know if Georgiana is finding this in her classes, that you're not just combating, you're not just affirming things that they've learned that are actually accurate, you're also having to combat things that they get on the internet that are not actually true. And so young people are experiencing both of those things that we have to be careful about sort of helping them understand what are legitimate sources and what are not. I think it's also important to note that in America, we say that young people are very progressive, but people of color are overrepresented in the young population. And so if you look at young white people, then they, not the majority, but something like 48% of them were Trump supporters. And so it's not true that all young people are progressive in this country. What is true is that the vast majority of young people are overwhelmingly people of color, and people of color tend to support progressive issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Georgiana?
Very briefly, I think it's great that young people educate themselves through social media and other things that are easily accessible to them. The problem is that they're so easily accessible, and they foster a kind of passiveness or passivity in the face of really what needs to be done. So I think a lot of young people have come to believe that absorbing the information, absorbing the issues, and saying, yes, I agree, or laughing at the right joke is already political engagement. And it's not, right? I mean, young people still vote less than older groups. So there are ways that they can be made to participate politically that are not necessarily linked with cheering on their favorite TV personalities. And so it is a great start, but I think, and sometimes I feel a university probably should play a role in this. There should be some way of making young people craft this connection between their political ideals and reality, and find ways of linking those two, maybe more practically, also at universities and in schools.
Okay, thank you very much, Georgiana. We are at the end of our time. I have 2 more questions though, so I'm going to read them out and ask you to do 1-sentence answers, okay? So the first one is, so why did Trump comparatively gain votes among Black voters? Or maybe we'll just do one. Melanie's going to answer that one, and you are going to answer the next one, Georgiana.
Oh, I want to answer this one too.
Oh, please, I would love to hear your answer, because I don't have a like part. In my heart, I don't have a good answer. In my brain, I think part of it is a belief in sort of anti-immigration among African Americans that he taps into around racial competition. I think some of it is African Americans who did well under a Trump administration were continuing to support it, and African Americans are overwhelmingly evangelical, and so I think all 3 of those things tie into it.
Mm-hmm. Georgiana?
Well, I mean, just like a catchword for me is multi-ethnic whiteness. It's this tendency for a lot of minority groups to want to join the so-called center, to become white, to behave in a white way. And that includes a lot of racism, really. So people who have suffered from racism do not shy away from discriminating against other people, right? So there are a lot of Latinos at the border with Mexico that voted for Trump because they don't like illegal refugees. And this is something that is going to increase over time. You know, this idea that white can really be many colors.
Yeah, and it's a famous "the boat is full" syndrome, right? The most recent immigrants are the most against more immigrants coming. And maybe that's also a very simple thing. I can't help but throwing that comment in here that 50 Cent made. He loved Trump's tax reform and said, if Biden gets elected, I'm going to be 20 cents instead of 50 cents. And that's why I'm voting for Trump. So just on the side.
I mean, capitalism is important to all capitalists,
Yeah.
right? Regardless of race. Regardless of
skin color, right? So, and the last question is actually directly directed to Georgiana, and it's a question: do you believe German colonial history is sufficiently represented in curriculums in Germany? I think there's a very short answer to that.
No.
Thank you. Okay. Absolutely. I think we can all agree on that. And we are a few minutes over the time, and I think we have answered all the audience questions right now. I personally have a whole bunch of other questions that I would love to discuss with you, but it's getting late and we do not want to keep our audience much longer. So I think at this point, I can just thank you both again very, very much for your wonderful contributions, for your insights, and for your passion for these issues that really matter. And to all of us, because racial justice is not something that's just for the purpose or sake of minority communities, but I think racial justice is very important for all of society. You know, it's about, as Martin Luther King once put it, it's about the soul of the nation, you know, or in that case of all of our nations. If we want to become healthy as a people and live in harmony and peace, we need to have the tough talks and talk about the issues that make people uncomfortable. But ultimately, this it's just when a wound heals, it's always sort of most painful before it starts actually really healing. And I think that's very important. I also would like to use this opportunity to thank again so much Martina and Christiane from the German Embassy and the America House in Stuttgart, or rather the German American Center as it's called now. Thank you so very much for putting this event on, which I thought was tremendously enjoyable and important. And also all the Consul Generals in Germany who supported the event, and of course, especially Consul General Darion Akins, who was joining us for it. So thank you all, and I hope you're going to have a lovely rest of the evening, or in Texas, rest of the day.
Right.
In Texas. So take care, and I hope to see you again sometime.